Hi, welcome to Write More Light. My name is Sarah. I'm with the Midwest Writing Center, and today we're going to have a really difficult, maybe, conversation, but a very, very important one. I've taught this in sort of a workshop. Um, Gosh, what's it called? Setting, a workshop setting before, and I've also done it like this, sort of more like a lecture. And I'm super excited. I hope we get an audience here so I can interact with you, so we can answer the difficult questions, have a real, honest, authentic conversation about it. But this is a really important thing for us to talk about, especially, when we really want to be good people, we really want to be inclusive. We want to, tell rich, full stories without excluding or, further marginalizing groups of people. So the first thing at the end of the video, I'm going to talk about what's up at the Midwest Writing Center, and then I'm going to encourage you to journal because this is tough content and really, really worth your time and energy, but you also need your energy when all is said and done. So the first thing I'm going to say on this topic is anytime, because I'm really kind of about to list groups of people, anytime you're going to list groups of people, don't. Any list you'll ever use is problematic. And no matter what you do, no matter how inclusive you're trying to be, you will leave people out, which is problematic. So the real thing we're talking about here is when you want to talk about a marginalized group that you don't belong to, right? If I wanted to talk about, see, anytime you want to list people, it gets bad. However, I do want to say, this is not necessarily exclusively about race or gender or sexuality or ableism, but any time there is a potential for someone to be from a group different from your own, especially if that group is marginalized, you need to be really careful about how you proceed. And like I just did when I was listing kinds of people, don't list kinds of people. I just want to be clear that this is to be all encompassing, not exhaustive. There's so much information out there. The general rule of thumb is going to be use your favorite search engine, find what people from whatever group it is that you're interested in talking about, find what they're saying. That's going to be the first rule every time. Use the internet, you have it at your disposal. Don't go to your friend who looks different or has different romantic interests or whatever from you and ask them. It's not their job. There is someone out there who's offering that information to you for free. Don't make your friend speak on behalf of a whole community. That's super uncomfortable, and your friend's gonna like you less afterwards. And it doesn't help the world. That information's already up there for the taking. Yeah, so there's a lot of content to cover here, and my notes are a little disorganized, but I hope you'll bear with me because there's not a great way to get more organized than to just do the thing. There of course is, I could type my notes someday and then I could reorder them much more easily. But the big question, right? The big topic is, how do you know if this is your story to tell? Generally, if something happened to you, it's your story. That's more for our nonfiction peeps, for our poets. Anything that happens to you is your story to tell. We run into that a lot with folks who are writing like about their sister's experience. You can run into a lot of trouble with that because it's not your story. Talk to your sister, of course, but make sure you're delicate with that. Now, when we go outside of our own circle, people who with similar identities to us, you need to look at representation, appropriation, erasure, and othering. Um, so obviously what happens a lot is we think, oh, I want to make sure I include, I'm not excluding some group of people. Um, and we find sometimes somebody puts every single identity in one character. Um, say a cis white woman, straight woman author is like, oh, I don't want to exclude anyone. So they have a disabled person of color who is queer, who that's that's a lot. That's a lot. Granted, those people exist. There are definitely disabled, queer, brown people in the world. Um, but that's sort of a lazy thing to do too. That character isn't representing much if they're representing everything. So I would definitely look at your characters and make sure you're reflecting the world at large, right? In movies, we see a lot of like the black best friend in this white friend group. Um, that's tokenizing. We're like, oh, look, I have a black character, and then that black character represents all black people. That's a problem. So just um, in real life, people from other backgrounds pop up every day, at at every chance. You've got a neighbor who's a different religion from you, and the person at the bank that you work with has a different skin color, and your brother has a different sexual preference from you, etc. There's no like entering any room outside of your house and not encountering someone different from you. So keep that in mind when you're writing. I know a lot of folks in like small towns or whatever have a very homogenous setting a lot of the times. So that's maybe not true, but um, if you're writing a story that takes place in a different setting from the one that you're existing in, there's that to pay attention to. Research is really annoying. Especially in like fiction, I for a long time was kind of anti doing research for fiction. I'm like, this is my exploration and my creation, and this is where I get to not hold back and just be whatever comes out of me comes out of me, and that's great. That's totally allowed. But if you are wanting to show people, then in that revision, you're going to have to look at these things, and you're going to have to look at these things because you don't want to be hurtful. I mean, you're watching this video because you care, right? You want to make sure that you're being inclusive. You want to make sure that you're being realistic. You want to make sure that you're not hurting people or excluding people. That's why you're here. I don't need to tell you. That's something that I sometimes forget, that you're not arguing with me, at least not that I know of. And you already know why it's important to be inclusive, and you're trying to do that with sensitivity. That's why you're here. So othering is the big thing in that list of 4 things that I just said a moment ago: representation, appropriation, erasure, and othering. We talk about appropriation a lot in life, right? We don't want to see people adopting religious iconography or clothing, hairstyles that belong to a marginalized group or a marginalized sect. And this is where it becomes appropriation, when it is looked down upon or fetishized, right? It's made romantic, mystical, to do that thing in your own home when you belong to this group. And then when a person from a dominant culture, generally speaking, that is the cis, het, white, male, whatever group, adopts that. So if I am looked down upon it for engaging with it in my home, in my religion, in my culture, and then the white people pick it up, again, not necessarily white, um, that's when it's appropriation. And when it's fetishized, it's when you look at that thing and you call it exotic, you call it mystical, magical. You want it to um, appreciate, but you don't actually necessarily understand it. That's fetishization. Now, othering is when we take a person, a symbol. We're talking about people. We're talking about people, um, and we exoticize them without that romantic aspect, right? We're engaging with this people, and it is very clear from the way that we talk about them, and we'll talk about how to use language too, that they are other. That's why lists are problematic. Anytime you have a list and you're like blah 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 and normal, then you're like, oh, so those other things aren't normal. Or anytime you like go into all this great detail about why this thing is interesting or new or different, that's not new and different if you belong to this culture or group. There was that book that got a lot of flack. I didn't read it, so American Dirt, I think. And the author of that book was a white woman, and she wrote from the point of view of a someone living in a Latino community, I believe, a Latino person. Um, and something she did that was very othering. Again, I haven't read it. This is excerpted from friends who did. Is she described in great detail the skin color of these people who were close to the narrator. And that's not something you would do if you were from that culture. You would just, these are just people, right? There's a saying that I'm going to totally butcher that's something along the lines of there are no camels in the Quran. Meaning, if something's totally normal to you, you're not going to talk about it. So that's a good tip, actually. If something should be totally normal, it's not going to be discussed in detail. So there's also something difficult in description is we need to be careful with the words we use to describe the other, because if we don't want to other, we need to make sure that we're not fetishizing or villainizing, right? That can be difficult. I know that when what we just are trying to do is describe a human being, it's really easy to use adjectives that are maybe too nice or too dark. Dark meaning mean, I guess. This is a point where you'll probably want to reread your stuff. You'll want to get a friend to read it or a beta reader. Again, be careful about asking your friends from marginalized groups to do emotional labor on your behalf. I would say, if you're looking for a beta reader, and this will come up again, you can find them on the internet, people who are willing to do the emotional labor. When you're talking for an oppressed people and you are the demographic of the oppressor, you need to understand the history of oppression. This is generally speaking why you shouldn't do that. There's a history of oppression that exists in our world, especially in the West, which is where I am. I'm in the US. And if I were to take on the narrative of an oppressed people when I am from the dominant culture, then I am owning a narrative that I am a party to oppressing. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm actively engaged in oppressing this group of people. I may do all the work in the world to make sure that I am empowering, that I am a co-conspirator, that I'm a solid ally. But if I'm going to speak on behalf of someone who my ancestors oppressed, where I am benefiting from a culture or a system that is hurting this group, then it is problematic for me to speak for them because of that history of oppression. There's a lot in this world that makes it easier for me to tell a story about a marginalized group than it is for that marginalized group to speak for themselves. Particularly, with socioeconomic class, skin color, presentation, how I look, how I dress, whatever. It would make it easier for me to have access to an audience or someone with power than someone who has less money, fewer resources, less education, darker skin, doesn't present so cis, etc. I might need to define my terms, huh? I apologize. I didn't realize maybe cis is something that not all folks know. Cis just means not trans. So it means that I identify with the gender I was assigned at birth, if I am cis. If I am trans, it means I don't identify with the gender I was assigned at birth. That's not an oversimplification. That's just what those words mean. Again, straight means attracted to the opposite gender. If I don't think I say hetero very often, but cis het would mean straight, attracted to the opposite gender, and also identifies with the gender assigned at birth. Okay. When I say marginalized people, I mean a group of people who have experienced oppression. That's it. That can mean a ton of different things. Generally speaking, it doesn't mean, one human being who was bullied. It means a group of people who have experienced oppression from a dominant group. Okay, sorry that it took me so long to get to this point where I define my terms. Okay. Now, how to research and what to research is also really difficult when you want to make sure that you are not feeding into an oppressive narrative or a problematic narrative. But I would say always, always, always use the internet when it is available to you, especially if you exist outside of a culture that you are trying to write about, write to, write for, or whose story you're going to tell. Again, general rule of thumb, don't tell the story of an oppressed people if you do not belong to that group. They are better equipped to tell their own stories, and they may have fewer opportunities. Again, for all those reasons that give us privilege or don't give us privilege. A very, very important thing to do when discussing, knowing, debating whether or not this is your story to tell. I assume that none of us are trying to write into an identity we don't belong to because it's trendy, but sometimes that's a thing. Maybe you have an assignment to write from someone else's identity or point of view. Cool. It's a useful thing to do, but don't try and get an audience if it's not your story to tell, and also maybe examine why you're telling the story, or where you can go with this assignment. Maybe there's an identity outside of your own that you can speak into that isn't going to be problematic. For instance, if I wanted to write from the point of view maybe of someone who has different political ideology from me, that is not at all problematic in the way that writing from someone with a different skin color from me would be. Examine your motives. Why do you want to tell this story? Why do you want to write this character? If you're trying to play savior, you will likely not be doing justice to the community that you're trying to serve. When using tragedy in the lives of marginalized people, you are feeding into a toxic narrative and fetishizing their trauma. And trauma is not a plot device. That one is a particular pet peeve of mine. Trauma is not a plot device. It's not super relevant to this topic, but it is lazy storytelling. So when you have a character from a marginalized background who experiences trauma, especially if you are not from that marginalized background, um, you're feeding into a toxic narrative because especially for like it happened for a long time. Anytime you were watching a movie, reading a book about queer characters, by queer, I mean folks who are gender or sexual minorities, um, they would die or they would get assaulted every single time. And this is teaching us, if this is the only narrative we're engaging with, this is teaching us that your life will be tragic if you belong to this community. Number one, it's not giving any representation that tells a nice story, and it fetishizes their trauma because it says this is what makes a good story about this kind of person. It also, when you use trauma as a plot device, you're saying like identity is born from trauma when identity can be born from anything, especially survival, which is not where trauma narratives come from. A diverse set of characters is good, but wearing another's identity, especially of a marginalized person, that's bad. So you can have your character be of a similar background, doesn't have to be similar to you, but of a similar background to you, and surrounded by people who are not similar to you. But when you're trying to tell a story that is specifically about and from the point of view of someone who's very, very different from you and is a marginalized person, again, different and marginalized are not the same, then you're taking space from a marginalized person, and you're also telling their story inauthentically. For example, what if the book The Hate You Give was written by a white woman? It would not be the same story. It wouldn't be written with an understanding innate to the culture, right? Then we have books like The Help, in which a white person is telling the story of and trying to really engage with Black culture, and is doing it in a way that is doing a service to this white person's sense of self and identity, and her role in ending racism, which isn't a thing. It's far more complicated than that. And while it may be a good book, I haven't read it. That is a problematic narrative. We also have Memoirs of a Geisha, which was written by a white man, about a culture he doesn't belong to. He's an American, I believe, could be British. And I mean, kind of the point is fetishization, right? This is specifically about marginalized people. It is not about people different from you. And I'm using that term different from a lot, but I specifically mean marginalized groups. We're all afraid to get it wrong, right, when we're telling these stories. But as marginalized people, we're gonna, this is now I'm speaking as marginalized people, we fear being a poor spokesman for our people, or being seen as a poor, or being seen as a spokesperson for a huge community, because no individual is that. No individual should be the spokesperson for a whole community of people, especially a community of people that they don't necessarily know, right? You can't know all people who share your skin color, all people who share your religion, all people who share your gender identity or your sexual identity or your disability. And there I am, right, listing kinds of people. Don't do that. Be accountable and be willing to be corrected. Accept the criticism you're given in good faith, and remember that those people who you are asking for help, for support, for feedback are doing it for you. They're doing an emotional labor for you. So when they say something really, when they say something critical, really take that feedback, think about it, let it marinate, and be accountable. You can fix these issues. And if it is your story to tell, you can tell it. I will confess, I totally well intended, just sort of exploring something that I found really fun. I wrote a picture book about a child from a um, ethnic background different from my own, and um, thankfully didn't show that many people. But I realized like it was my first picture book that I ever finished, and I realized it's just going to stay that way. I'm not going to be able to move forward with it in good faith, and that's a bummer. Um, but it's not my story to tell, so I will leave it shelved, and that's fine. That's the way it is. Um, if I can find a different way to tell this story so that I'm not talking about a culture that isn't my own, if I can change it, that's cool. Maybe I'll do that. But I just need to be okay with not moving forward with that piece because it's not my place. And I am. It's been a couple years. And it's going to be a bummer, but it's the right thing to do. And it's not about me. That was the point. Accept the criticism, be accountable, and remember it's not about you. If you are searching, if you are looking to be in speaking in good faith, telling the story in good faith, then we need to remember and accept our accountability and that it isn't about us if we are trying to be good people. When doing research, I know this is a little disorganized, I apologize. When doing research, this is an extra step, and it is a very important extra step. You need to know who did the research that you're using, who made the research materials, and what makes them a good source. For instance, having a degree does not mean having lived experience. There are plenty of people from that dominant culture who are researching marginalized people, and that doesn't make as good a source as the actual lived experience of the people, and those people are telling their own stories, and that should be where you get your research. Unless it's like statistical research or something, then probably numbers are numbers. And but it's also important to know, where was that research? Who funded that research? Where did the money come from to do that research? Because that will also color the slant, the angle, the results of that research. Marginalized people also often have a culture invisible to dominant groups, and it's easy to stereotype when we haven't delved deep enough or accessed it. So this leads to both feeding into stereotypes and into fetishization, because so much is below the surface, especially if all that you know is from pop media, right? If it's from TV, if it's from books, and it's not from the original source, right? The primary source. So make sure that you put the marginalized voices first. Look into who from this culture is already writing. Someone I really admire, an author I really admire, is Rick Riordan, who after he started writing, so he started with the Percy Jackson book series, and he started writing more and more cultures, mythology stories. And then he realized there are people from these cultures who are telling their own stories, their own mythologies in a modern context. And so he started doing like Rick Riordan Presents. And so he's advertising, he's spotlighting, he's magnifying these writers who are telling their own culture's stories. And that's so important. And that's the work of an ally. So if you want to engage with these stories, make sure that you are going to the source, and make sure that you're giving light, shining light on the people who are doing that work. That is more important than telling the story. It is, unfortunately, I'm sorry to say this, it's really, really selfish to decide that you are the one who is going to tell this story if that story does not belong to you. And I know that, and I've done that. Um, and I have been selfish. Um, we must be able to swallow our pride on this thing in order to be better people, especially as artists. It's um not truly our best work if it is not work that is honest to us and to the people around us. um Representation, appropriation, and othering is where you're going to want friends or sensitivity readers a lot of the time. So this is like a big no-no in workshopping, which is why, I mean, it's not a big no-no, but in cool, hip workshop circles, it's a no-no. But a lot of the times, this stuff comes down to word choice. You know, the words we choose when describing a human being or a culture or like a party or whatever, are very, very powerful, particularly when we're dealing with a marginalized culture. So um, that's why you want a beta reader. Again, you can find those on the internet. Just, you know, go to your favorite search engine and look for beta readers and this topic. You're going to find a bunch of forums, not this topic, whatever topic it is that you're working with. There's, you know, I've done this totally unwittingly before, where I'm describing, I think, a family member, and the words I use, because I don't know, really liked the color. This was pointed out to me kind of recently about something I wrote a decade ago, so more than a decade ago. So it didn't compute to me until way later, after I, you know, forgot and didn't care anymore. And now I'm very, very attuned to it. But the words I used to describe skin color were problematic because they were like overly positive. They were fetishizing. And I'm really, really grateful for the person who pointed that out to me, because it probably never would have occurred to me. And now I can look at the things that I'm working on now and look for that. Again, this is why you need beta readers. This is why you need friends. There's a balance in understanding a culture and over describing or whitewashing it. If you're over describing, you're probably othering or fetishizing. And if you try too hard to make it sound like whatever you think normal is, you may end up whitewashing the culture. Again, I think the best way to know if you're doing this is with a beta reader or a proofreader, a friend. But it really has to be somebody that you trust, and somebody who's willing to do this labor, because it is emotional labor. So just choosing your best friend. If they are too similar to you, they're not going to be able to notice all of this stuff. You want to know, when you think about the history of oppression, that if you are speaking from the skin of the oppressor, how will this piece be received by the dominant culture and by the culture that you are representing? And you want to think about how your personal history isn't going to be relevant to the audience. So they're not going to know. They're not going to know who you are, where you come from. They're going to see your bio and that's it, right? Maybe your photo. And so it's not going to matter to them all these little details about where you were raised or how you were raised or who your family is. And then also, I skipped something, I apologize, when I was talking about over describing and or whitewashing. If you say something like just like everyone else, you are saying one thing is normal. And generally speaking, that's going to end up being whitewashing. But anytime that you're like, oh, this thing is normal, then you're othering everything else. The really most important stuff, of course, is to know if you're being the difference between being an ally and taking up space, and looking at who's contributing to your story. So if there is someone from this culture who could be telling their own story, we need to make space for them and stop taking up space. In being an ally, we are making room for them, and we are not speaking for them, over them, or on their behalf. I see I've got a couple of people hanging out with me here, but I don't see any questions. I'm going to go ahead and call it good on this topic. I hope you benefited from this video. I hope that you're having a good time. I know this is a lot to think about, and it requires a lot of self-work. It requires a lot of emotional labor on everyone's behalf, everyone's part. So stuff coming up at the Midwest Writing Center. The most exciting thing, of course, is this Thursday we have our first Spectra event of the year. I had to think about that for a minute. It's our National Poetry Month reading, featuring the 14 amazing folks who participated in our Dead Poets Espresso poetry display. So join us Thursday night right here, 7 p.m. for a awesome kick butt reading. That's all I'm gonna give you tonight for today. It's 1:30 for stuff to look forward to. Now I encourage you, of course, as always, to write more light into your life, but do some journaling. This was heavy content. I'm going to journal too when I turn this camera off, because it's important to be able to get the yuckies out and get the thoughts out, and remember who we are and what our story is and what our place is. We do all have a story to tell, and it is so important that we tell our story fairly and we tell our story. Thank you so much for joining me today. Please write more light into your life.